It's time for my review of Season 2 of The Familiar of Zero. No long intro this time, I don't have much to say. You've probably watched the previous video if you're here. If not, you should probably watch that first. But if you're just jumping into this video, this will be a discussion of the entire season. This is not a spoiler-free review. As of this writing, I've seen nothing past Season 2 either. Anyway, this is going to be a long one, so let's just get right into it. This season had a very similar structure to the first season, starting out with sillier single-episode stories before rejoining the overarching story about the war with Albion. There were also a lot of weird similarities between the seasons. Siesta is dragged off to be a personal servant for a noble in episode 4. Of course, this time it's just treated as a stupid joke. There's something stolen from the school by an insider. Luis and Saito work at the charming Fairy Inn for one episode while they're on an undercover assignment. And then Luis gets married, sort of, at the end of the season to someone who dies. Unlike the first season, I'm going to go in roughly chronological order this time through. There are 6 points I'll be looking at in the first section of the review. Timestamps are in the description, of course. This review will be starting out with mostly things I didn't like at the start of the season before moving on to things that I liked by the end of the season. After running through the season, I have 2 aside points. The first about Dunkirk, and the second about World War II theming in general. They're somewhat related. Then I'm going to look at individual characters who I may not have had much reason to mention going through the season chronologically, to see how they've progressed since last season. And then I have a new section. This time I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the visuals of the show, because I barely touched on that in the first season review. And anime is a visual medium. And then lastly, at the end of the first season, I made note of things I was going to be watching for, as well as made several predictions. Now it's time to look back at those predictions and see which of them are holding true, as well as make a few more predictions for the future and add more things to the list to watch for. I thought I'd have a lot less to say for Season 2 once I'd discussed all the initial settings of the world, but that's not really the case. These reviews might just keep getting longer and longer until I'm finished with the series. Anyway, let's get right into it. Starting things out wrong, Episode 1 sucked! I didn't want to start out on an extremely negative note, but Episode 1 of Season 2 is the worst episode of the show so far. First off, it serves as the dreaded Season 2 reset, where a new romantic norm is established at the end of the previous season, only to rapidly degrade back to the old norm. In this case, Louise and Saito's relationship is immediately back on the rocks. This is not helped by how Saito is apparently the world's biggest horn dog now. Maybe I was just missing it in Season 1 because the camera was being respectful while the characters weren't, but Saito was not the constant boob-obsessed perv he is in this episode in Season 1. In Season 1, he kissed the princess in a hilarious misunderstanding. In this episode, he's digging for a relationship upgrade with her because apparently he's been smacked around so much by Louise that he's suffering severe brain damage. He acts completely inappropriately in many different scenes, even though he should definitely know better by this point. In addition to this stupidity makes the rest of the plot seem like a joke as well, and the introduction of new ideas and characters is also not even the greatest. Here's this new knight, Agnes, who has guns and is guarding Henrietta, whose really only personality trait in the first episode is being another character who can beat up Saito at the drop of a hat. Oh, and the mind control ring just happened to be stolen, by the way, off-screen, because apparently everyone's an idiot, and they're not bothering to have a heavy guard and a relic that toppled an entire nation last season, with an enemy thief at large who already broke into an impenetrable vault as well. And then in the next episode preview, as if it wasn't bad enough, it shows Prince Wales is still alive. All in all, it was basically the worst possible episode from what I want out of the show. Obviously, in the context of later episodes, some of the problems are fixed. Prince Wales is still dead and only back for a pretty well-explained reason. Agnes gets more character development, but in complete contrast to how good I thought Episode 1 of Season 1 was, this episode just immediately put a bad taste in my mouth. The OP and ED for Season 2 still suck. I think at this point I'm just not really gonna like the music much for this series. There's been nothing particularly notable in the rest of the soundtrack yet either, for good or for bad, but the credits, to me, continue to be aggressively bland. If anything, the visuals in the opening are even worse this time around than Season 1. However, the ending theme has a little bit of life to it at least, but not enough that I would consider it good. Maybe in other people's experiences it was good for what they'd watched, but I have to compare it to pretty much everything else I've seen, and it just does not stack up. The only comparatively forgettable opening themes I've seen from shows have been from Shield Hero and from Supersonico the animation, which I don't remember how either of them sound, but most things have much more memorable themes than this. This is the weakest overall aspect of the show so far. But before you think I hate everything about the first half of the season, though, I don't really object to anything in episodes 2 and 3. They were pretty good, I just don't have much to say about the episodes. But now let's just get on to one more thing I don't like. The dumb harem parts. I didn't really complain about the harem elements in Season 1. This is partly due to how hard it is to complain about something you already know that's going to be there. It's like visiting New York City and complaining that the subways are dirty and crowded. But in Season 1, the harem elements were not so frequent. In Season 2, the show gets far more annoying because it fails to add anything new to the harem. Just for clarification, here's what I'm considering the harem elements. Saito says something to piss off Louise and she beats the shit out of him. Saito interacts with Siesta in a way that gets misinterpreted and Louise beats the shit out of him. Saito interacts with Siesta in a way that's correctly interpreted and Louise beats the shit out of him. Saito does something pervy to Louise's sister and she beats the shit out of him. Saito acts like a no-good horn dog around Henrietta and one of several different characters beats the shit out of him. And something about lacy underwear. You may notice this is the same thing happening over and over again, and the more the show uses Saito getting beat up as a punchline, the less funny it becomes. And it also makes any physical violence meaningless, charms the rest of the story as well. I already don't expect Saito to be severely injured, but do remember that he was unconscious for 3 days after his fight with Guiche early in Season 1. The story has asked us to take body blows seriously before, and I really have to object to this inconsistent tone. There's a world of difference between someone being comically dragged around or their face stretched out, and someone being beaten to the point of visible marks. They finally treat Louise abusing Saito seriously in episode 10, and it's a little effective, I guess, but I don't think it'll stop her in the future. But I wouldn't even bother to bring this up if it, again, wasn't also extremely unfunny. Episodes 1, 4, and 5 are all full of dumb harem parts that I didn't like. Meanwhile, Louise and Saito have reached a standstill in their relationship where nothing's really happening. Saito is repeatedly defending Louise and showing her affection, and then gets screwed over by the plot the next episode. Things like Saito has to look at breasts to identify the identity of the thief keep recurring, and, well, there goes any progress they made. I like Louise as a tsundere towards others still, she just has very little chance to show it. She's still stuck with an inferiority complex and looked down upon by just about everyone, especially her own family, and is even left out of missions as part of Henrietta's secret squad, the only people who actually know that she's valuable. But most of the time she's just beating Saito, and if it's ever framed like she's using him as a scapegoat for her frustrations and taking out her anger at the world on him when he doesn't deserve it, that would be interesting. But so far that hasn't been the case. To give a better explanation for these elements other than I don't like it, I think it comes down to narrative focus. The harem elements rarely intersect with the main political plot of the series, so to be worthwhile scenes, there's 3 other purposes they can serve. 1. They can help us better understand the characters or world. Any scene with characters interacting has the potential for character growth and for the audience to understand the characters or world better. This was frequently the purpose of Siesta in Season 1. While Saito talked to her, we learned a lot more about her, the world, and the history of people from Earth crossing over to the world. I can't say the same for Season 2. The only thing we've learned is that Siesta is still determined to win over Saito, which just leads to more beatings for him. 2. Further the actual plot of relationships. A love triangle doesn't have to go nowhere. If one character in a scene is making an earnest effort to win the affection of another, that is the scene's purpose. Despite how inevitable it seems that Louise and Saito are a destined couple, Siesta hasn't given up on Saito yet, and Louise is frequently a total piece of shit, giving Saito clear reason to look for something else in a relationship, despite how he inevitably comes back to her side. The story is hinged on its characters, developing their relationships is important. 3. Comic relief. This ideally would be combined with the other points as well, but having just a simply ridiculous B-plot with a very serious A-plot makes for funny moments that actually land. Humor is very subjective, but I did indeed find some things in this show funny still. Episode 11 is the best example of this for Season 2. The skimpy animal outfits that Louise and Siesta put on are so silly and such a break from the serious tone of the rest of the episode that it doesn't matter that there's no explanation where they got them from. It's a joke. It's a dumb competition to win over Saito, and it shocks all the bystanders with their shamelessness. It's funny. So again, my problem with the dumb harem parts comes when none of these three things happen in a scene. And unfortunately, Season 2 has a lot of these. I was not entertained by it, and it just made me hate those episodes. Now let's get on to the second half of the season, where there's stuff I liked and want to talk about. The last three plot points I will look at for this season are all centered around the same thing: the ethics of war. Agnes's Inferno. Agnes is a good character. She's competent and driven, but also not so loyal or honorable that she puts her duties above getting revenge. She is not inclined to forgive misdeeds regardless of current circumstances, and also doesn't care about social norms or manners as much as the rest of the cast. Yet we still have a good sense of what she will do in a situation. Even before the culmination of her arc in this season, she had lots of good scenes and tells the audience a lot about the world. As I expected last season, her overall purpose in the plot supports the single bad actors in the government aspect of the story. Between the "it's always darkest at the base of the lighthouse" conversation and the scene where she directly states that Henrietta is good, it's just others who are the problem, clearly the series isn't challenging the role of the monarchy. But as long as there's some antagonist to root out, that's all you need for a good domestic political plot. Agnes's hometown was burned down by the Tristan army on false pretenses because there was a rebellion forming there. The subtitles I read called them Protestants, but since there's been no explanation of the world's religion as of yet, and this isn't expanded on in any way, I'm not going to try to analyze that part at all. Somebody was planning something, and the city got burnt. It's foreshadowed pretty heavily that Colbert saved Agnes from the destruction of her village. However, it was entirely unexpected to me that he also destroyed her village in the first place, even though in retrospect the foreshadowing for that was sorta obvious as well. At the start of the season it's brought up that Colbert is a fire mage, which Agnes hates, with as much subtlety as I just used right there. Obviously, it surprised me anyway, but now I think they probably could have introduced that Colbert was a fire mage in a lot of less blatant ways. In the overall political scope of the story, it's unclear if there's an overarching conspiracy to overthrow royal families, or just the minister in Tristan wanted more power without being involved at all with the rebellion in Albion. Ordering Agnes's village burned didn't seem to have to do with anything foreign. For that matter, while Sheffield is set up to be a big bad ultimate villain with a master plan, it's entirely speculation at this point what her plan is as well. She could just want to sow chaos to grab political power or have a legitimate hatred of royalty. Back in the actual plot, Agnes's arc comes to a head in episodes 8 and 9, with the invasion of the school by mercenaries. While I wasn't particularly tense, there was still lots of genuine character drama and Agnes's values pitted against each other. And revenge wins out. Yes, she still ends up killing the leader of the attackers on the school, but Colbert would probably have survived if she didn't have conflicting priorities and attacked him as well. The mercenary leader also having his own history and priorities explained also really starts out the arc of humanizing the enemy that continues to the end of the season. Even if the first person to get this treatment is not at all sympathetic, he has pretty much the same goals as Agnes. There's a lot to like in these episodes. My only actual gripe about them is that they feel like they're sort of padded out and really could have been one episode. There was so much standing in one place talking during fights it felt like I was watching a shonen series. Throughout Season 2, there were many moments that I felt like ideally would have occurred earlier in the story. For example, Guiche says goodbye to Mon when he goes off to join the army, but that already happened at the end of Season 1. Many things need to be addressed by the country going to war, and to give the benefit of a doubt, it was probably not seen as dramatically necessary to have all those scenes in Season 1 right before the climax of the season. But many conversations in Season 2, especially about impending conflict, seem to ignore that the main characters have already been involved in battle and killed people. However, with Colbert's pleading not to put themselves in danger, it actually helps. Colbert knows that they've been involved in the war. He probably even knows that Louise is a void mage, if there's anybody that does, as he's seemingly aware of all their missions and fixed up the plane when Saito inevitably crashes it. And knowing this, he still tries to convince them to stay out of any more conflict. The scene where Louise reads Colbert's letter after his death has some of the best framing in the series. While the contents of the letter are obvious, the setting emphasizes the points I just discussed. Instead of taking place in just any room, it's in the shed with the Zero, which intrudes into the frame as a reminder of the reality that they can't hide from war and the actions they've already taken. It's also just a nice visual tie-in to where Colbert was seen the most, taking care of the plane for the love of discovery despite it being a weapon of war. His relationship with this plane reminds me a bit of Jiro's character in The Wind Rises. It's obviously not a perfect parallel, as The Wind Rises, however fictitious, is, about the guy who actually designed the Zero, not just some mechanic who likes planes. But the attraction to the plane for the love of invention, despite what it represents, is still there. Now, moving forward, let's see how Colbert's goal of inspiring empathy and pacifism in Saito affects the rest of the plot. Snow and Sympathy. In episode 10, Louise and Saito go on a bombing run over the Alps and get shot down. There's a couple of things that don't make much sense in this episode, but the mountains actually aren't one of them. Real-world England's not full of snowy mountains, but Albion is a magically floating island in the air. In addition to its higher altitude making permanent snow cover more likely, it's also a fantasy story. I don't care about the mountains. I do care that the bombing run is stupid. Okay, they don't call it a bombing run, but that's what it essentially is. Ostensibly, Henrietta wants Louise to blast the Albion army, but there's still civilians in the town, it's not clear where the army is, Louise doesn't have very good control of her magic, and even if they don't care about civilian casualties, they still intend to take the town with military force, they don't want it completely destroyed. So, what's the goal here? It doesn't matter because the bombing run fails. I don't even try to run away despite the Zero being established to be much faster than fire dragons, and then they're punished for Saito's reluctance to shoot down the enemy dragons by being brought down as well. And then the Albion forces pull out of the city along with all their supplies. It's not clear why this matters either, because the town is retaken with mind control magic, not supply loss. It shows that Tristan's leaders are nicer than an usurper with a secret agenda, but that's really not saying anything. But anyway, that's nitpicking, and it's not important for what this episode is really about, forming a connection with the enemy. Louise and Saito crash on a snow-covered mountain and run into Henry, an Albion soldier who is also stranded on the mountain due to Saito filling his dragon with holes, and who is also suffering from nationalism. The crux of this episode is that Henry and Louise, despite being enemies, are of the same mind about a noble's role for their country. Saito seems to convince Henry that he should not abandon love for honor, and that his main goal should be to survive the war and return home. So, at least for this moment, that seems like it should be Saito and Louise's goal as well, right? Survive the war and stay together instead of sticking their necks out on risky missions like they've been doing, right? We'll come back to that. To finish up all this setup and contrast, Guiche finally reappears in episode 11 to talk about how proud he is to murder for his country. Showing this contrast in ideals is already powerful storytelling, and it's even more effective coming from not a random soldier, but from someone the audience already knows, was initially very reluctant or even afraid to go to war. We don't see him on the battlefield, but we do see the man he has become, ready to extol the glory of his nation and bask in his accomplishments. Taking his attitude in episodes 10 and 11, Saito has clearly been affected by Colbert's pleadings and is in the Cry of the Banshee mindset. What's the Cry of the Banshee mindset? Yeah, I was just looking for an excuse to mention that song. But it's also what Saito's attitude is towards the aristocrat's ideal of honor. But that changes a lot in episode 12. The plot goes bad, and Tristan's forces have to flee from their foothold on Albion. I'll talk more about this in a second, because what matters for the characters is not the actual war, but what they're willing to lose. Louise will gladly die to protect Henrietta, even if it's a pointless death and Henrietta insists that she should not. Saito will do anything to protect Louise, so his eventual solution is to die a pointless death to protect her against her will. Does this make Saito any different from the nobles he has derided since his arrival? Let's examine this more. If the series were to end right here, it would be an appropriate end for a tragedy. Their stubborn determination to be together is the only thing that keeps the lovers apart. But the series doesn't end here. There's still 2 more seasons and a lot more light novel volumes, and Saito is still very much alive. Instead, this is just a personality trait for him now. Saito wrestled with morality this season, and it seemed like he was swinging towards being an avowed pacifist like Colbert, but all it took was the right motivation for him to forget all that and value one life over all others. Saito has definitively rejected pacifism. He could have taken Louise and flown away in his plane if all he cared about was just saving her. But like it or not, he set out to die to uphold the same principles as the people he was defending. Now, as for the entertainment value of this episode, it's pretty good. Louise needs to stop going to Albion, though. Every time she's there, she marries a man who's deceiving her and then he dies. From a dramatic standpoint, Saito's suicide mission goes quite well. He does excessive visceral and well-animated damage and goes out with a bang. We get to see just how powerful Gandalfir, the left hand of God, is when he doesn't hold back. The cuts back to Louise and the flower are great to add to the emotions of the scene. This was a much higher high than the end of Season 1. Up until Saito and Louise meet again, and their relationship status immediately devolves back into the same normalcy of beatings. But I guess they knew they had another season coming at this point, so why wait until the start of next season to reset their relationship? They're gonna keep fighting as long as they continue to appear on screen together. Am I satisfied with this ending? I'll be a lot less satisfied if they try to walk back Saito's actions next season. Relationship changes are one thing, but Saito is now completely committed to Tristan's cause, even if indirectly, and he can't walk away from being a killer. Aside, Dunkirk. So if you watch more than just anime, you're probably aware of the movie Dunkirk from 2017. About the British evacuation of Dunkirk as the German armies swept through France at the start of World War II. While it got a bunch of hype and awards, I personally thought the movie was very overhyped. In addition to a few stupid things happening, like a character dying an allegedly tragic and noble death by falling downstairs and hitting his head nowhere near the battlefield, my main problem with it was that while it showed good individual stories, it completely missed the point as to why anyone remembers the evacuation of Dunkirk at all. The scale. 330,000 soldiers were evacuated from the French coast across the Channel to England. It wasn't an isolated incident, it was the end of the first chapter of World War II, giving the Axis powers complete control over the European continent. While I was looking for comparisons to actual English history in The Familiar of Zero, I don't think the retreat from Albion is supposed to be Dunkirk. But I do think that Dunkirk the movie showed drama and danger a lot better. The Familiar of Zero's evacuation, just like the movie Dunkirk, only shows a few characters and never really shows the full scale of the operation that's allegedly occurring. But in The Familiar of Zero, Episode 12, there is not even a sign of the approaching enemy. At Dunkirk, both in the movie and historically, there were planes in the sky strafing the beach, and submarines lurking in the channel to attack transport ships. In Episode 12, no one is attacking the fleeing transport ships. There were flying units on both sides in the Season 1 finale. What happened to them? To be the last line of defense, Saito has to physically walk out to the massed enemy camp outside of the city, literally while the last ship is already leaving. The only drama in this scene is completely manufactured, and Saito's sacrifice is very obviously completely pointless from a military standpoint. Also, this last ship that's leaving is shown to have a bunch of civilians on it instead of soldiers. That is not who would be on the last ship out. Earlier I was looking at this scene from the perspective of character arcs and drama, but from a strategic standpoint, this episode is a complete and utter mess that should really have no drama in it whatsoever. Aside, World War II. Speaking of World War II, I will now propose my own reading of The Familiar of Zero, an examination of the Japanese experience in World War II. Please note that I'm an American who is not a historian, but these are things I picked up on. First thing is the obvious nuclear imagery from the end of Season 1. It's hard to see a bright destructive flash from a single source, from a single plane, as anything other than a nuke. This alone didn't make me try to draw conclusions immediately, but it's absolutely the equivalent of a nuke. What got me thinking about World War II specifically was Episode 3 in Season 2. While the men are at war, the women of the Academy are drilled for the defense of their country. This had very clear visual similarities to the actual civilian drilling in Japan during the close of World War II. And once I got thinking along those lines, we get to honor. Since I was looking for connections, I sure found them. Characters value their honor in defending their monarch above all else and will willingly lay down their lives in sacrifice, and that really makes me think of kamikaze missions and bonsai charges. Thus, this is the story of a man who is against nationalism and is anti-war, but who, despite his initial objections, is still pulled into a nationalist war and eventually becomes fanatically committed to the cause as well. And the ultimate message of the series is not one of faded love, but a cynical and cautionary tale about being radicalized into a conflict you should have nothing to do with by your peers helping to radicalize you. Now, that would be a fascinating interpretation if the story ended here at the end of Season 2 with Saito's death, but I think I was really reaching there for that interpretation. It would also be a far more compelling reading if the author of the series was a very old man who had actually lived through the war, and this was his take on it. I mean, he could have been inspired by the stories of someone else who did, but I really don't think that's what he was going for at all. That being said, I am going to keep looking at the series through this lens, in case there's anything interesting to say from this angle in the future, because there are some visual elements that really make me specifically think of World War II and not just armed conflict in general. You would think one of those reasons would be that Saito's warplane is a Zero. It's an iconic plane to the Japanese, but I think it was chosen mostly because of its name, to add an extra layer to the whole name of the series, and the association with the word Zero. When the plane is used just in the background of a scene as a visual, it's more important that it is a warplane or a tool of war in general, rather than that it is this specific plane. Characters. Now let's look at characters I may not have mentioned otherwise. Guiche. He disappeared for most of the season to be replaced as Pretty Boy by Giulio, but when he came back into the story, he was well defined and served a key purpose in the narrative. I hope he continues to develop as the story goes on, because he has the potential to be a very interesting character. Mon Mon. She did nothing this season and was a glorified background character. Giulio. He's just a lackluster replacement character so far who has done nothing notable. He's a less interesting Guiche, and he's also a less interesting Wards. I do appreciate that he serves as a potential romantic interest for Louise, because it's better drama if she also has alternatives to Saito, but so far he hasn't really done much to that end. Colbert. Wow, he really came out of the woodwork to be important, but he's dead now, so I don't think we'll learn anything more about him. Agnes. I already talked about her a lot, but she's the best character in Season 2. And she also gives us a little bit more information about plebeians, which I wanted to know more about. It's exactly where I thought it would be. The commoners love the queen, and it's the fault of other nobles for corruption and abuse of powers. Also, she's gay, apparently. I'll examine sexuality and the culture of the world at the end of the series, so I don't really have anything to add about this right now, because it hasn't been important yet. Tabitha. She showed up in episode 2 and kinda helped, and she also kinda helped in episodes 8 and 9. Narratively, though, she did nothing. Kirshi. She was along for the ride, doing just as much nothing as Tabitha. I'm expecting these two to be important at some point later, because they're still sticking around in the story and they're still showing up in the opening. Scaron. This guy has a lot of talents, apparently, from running a business to acting to being extremely buff and muscular and pulling a horse cart by himself. He also seems to be a die-hard capitalist who will go into a war zone to open a new branch of his business. Queen Henrietta. I'm pretty disappointed by Henrietta as a character so far. Basically, everything she does is motivated by love of her country and a desire for peace. But she has no personality outside of that. I guess I can say she lives the adage, if you want something done right, do it yourself, going to the front lines and taking an active role in rooting out corruption. But she doesn't really catch my interest as her own person. It's far more important what other characters think of her than what she thinks. Her one piece of characterization was that her love of Prince Wales sort of trumped her feeling of duty to her country, but he is dead now, so that probably won't come up again. The visuals. I didn't talk about this back in my Season 1 review because I don't really have all that much to say about the visuals of this show. Let's start with the backgrounds. The backgrounds are fine. I have even less to say about them than most other things. Generally, the only time you would even specifically call out the backgrounds in an anime is when they're particularly amazing or just particularly distracting. Like ugly CG in the backgrounds or whatever the hell W''Z was going for with all these filters and stuff. Or something particularly amazing like everything in Made in Abyss. The character designs I can at least say something about. The characters have generally distinct hair, but generally not particularly distinct faces. I think sometimes the lack of general detail that the characters have actually plays into the show's advantage, because characters in the background of a scene don't look particularly undetailed because they just look the same as they always do. There's not really much difference in any of the body shape of any of the characters, though. Kirshi obviously has big boobs. There's quite a few women that have big boobs, but that's really their only defining character trait. There's not really any characters other than Scaron who are particularly muscular or have a particularly notable body shape. They're all just sort of generically normal-sized. And then obviously Luis is much notably shorter and flatter than most of the other characters. The only real downside I think that this lack of detail leads to is on the occasions where the show tries to do fan servicey shots of characters looking sexually attractive, it just doesn't work. There is not enough detail in the character designs for them to look particularly attractive at all. Unless you're really into ill-defined generic bodies that don't really have much musculature at all. But that ain't me. It might seem strange, but I actually felt the same way about Kill la Kill, despite the very obvious sexuality all over that show. The clothes in Kill la Kill are extremely revealing, but at the same time the character designs themselves are not super attractive. The last thing about visuals is action scenes. I think a lot of the action scenes overall are not particularly amazing. The animation in the final episode has a lot of good cuts. Scattered across all the episodes of the series, there's quite a lot of good animation cuts. It's not consistently amazing, but on the other hand, it's good enough for what it is. I felt like to have a complete review, I needed to address the visuals at some point, but unless there's anything particularly amazing or particularly bad, I don't really see much point in bringing them up in the future. They're serviceable and there's not much else to say about them. One last thing about visuals that didn't even make it into my original script for this review. The sparkle transitions are gone. I complained about them in Season 1 and then didn't even notice that they'd vanished because they were so obnoxious that when they're gone it just looks correct. The series has actual cuts between scenes now and it looks so much better. So that's one huge improvement the visuals have made since the start of the series. Predictions past and present. After Season 1, I made note of things I'm watching for, and made some predictions for the future. Let's look at those again. Saito the Killer. For most of the season it looked like I would have to eat my words as Saito became much more averse to killing, even after he's shot down because of it. But love led to hate, and at the end of the season Saito went berserk on the enemy with just his sword. It wasn't a singular one-on-one confrontation I envisioned, but I'd say this prediction was correct. Saito has now directly and personally killed a lot of people. Expanding the harem. This didn't happen at all unless you count Henrietta, and I'm absolutely not, as she has so far shown no genuine attraction to Saito. It's just Louise versus Siesta. Kirshi kinda isn't even around anymore. Episode 1 does establish that Saito is attracted to pretty much every single female character at the school, but that's sort of meaningless. Limitations of powers. Void magic is still mostly a mystery at this point, but it's clear that Louise doesn't have very good control over her powers. There's no real explanation on how the powers actually work yet. The absent Fouquet. I had initially assumed that the Sandy Fouquet had probably stolen the ring back in Episode 1, but it was probably just Sheffield. So far we haven't seen the Fouquet at all, and she may just not come back into the story. The main cast survives, but more other people will die. I had never really considered Colbert to be a main character. I don't think I even mentioned him in my Season 1 review, so I don't know if I should consider this prediction correct so far or not. More political events will mirror actual events from European history. If there was any of this, I think I missed it this time around. I expected the war with Albion to be over before it started with the Void Magic nuke, but instead it's continuing. There wasn't really a super obvious tie-in to real-world history this season. Meeting an actual living displaced person from Earth. This has not happened yet. It still could, though. Now here are some new things that I'm watching for. Who is the fairy? I'm sure we'll find out eventually who the fairy is that saved Saito, and since I already know some of the characters in the series who haven't yet been introduced, I think I have a pretty good idea who she is already. What happened to Saito's weapons? His sword is still on his person in the final scene of Episode 2. I guess the fairy spirited that away too, but it seems far less likely that he just walked out of Albion with his plane. We can assume from the apparent frenzied evacuation that the Zero was left behind, as only he knew how to fly it. And in Episode 10, Albion was intent on capturing this bizarre weapon, so they would probably control it now, and can at least likely strip it for its guns, as this world has firearms and gunpowder. If Saito loses nothing long-term from dying and suddenly has his plane back in Season 3, I hope they at least explain it. What other fantasy creatures are in this world? In the final battle of this season, there are trolls, or orcs, or something big and green and angry. This is weird and it brings up a lot of questions. Like, are they another sentient species that's enslaved in this world? If they don't become important to the plot, it probably would have been better to just not show them at all, even if the light novel says they're there. I ask if they are intelligent because there are also apparently fairies now. I wonder if there'll be more creatures or races introduced as the story continues, because the introduction of these other humanoid races sort of comes out of nowhere. Relationship growth. Although I don't expect this to actually happen until the end of the series, because harem comedy, at some point Louise really needs to grow as a character by acknowledging her jealous personality and trying to change it and, be a little bit better of a person. If the series ends without this happening, I'll probably be rather unhappy with her character growth overall. Because while Saito has worked on self-improvement, mostly in combat rather than personality, but it's something, Louise has been a rather static character who just has things happen to her. There are a lot of characters in this series that have very forceful personalities that so far have not changed in the span of the story. I'm looking for some more development for all of them. I'm looking for more development for characters that have shown some as well, like what will Agnes do now that her goal of revenge has played out. And now, here are some new predictions. Guiche will die. I don't think this goes against my prediction that the main cast will all survive, because he has not really been a main part of the cast anymore. For dramatic weight, someone the audience knows, I think, really needs to die in an actual battle. So far, the only named deaths have been from small skirmishes, not in the middle of a giant battlefield. Since he's already survived a brush with death once, maybe this is actually a bad prediction. But I guess I'd just rather he die if someone has to, rather than, like Agnes, because killing the gay character is extremely overused. Even if she's the most likely to actually die due to just her general extreme recklessness. Now here's a wild prediction that I don't think will actually happen at all. When we next see the Zero, it'll be piloted by Henry, the Albion Dragon Rider Saito shot down in episode 10. And that's all the new predictions I have so far. And so, that's it for Season 2 of The Familiar of Zero. Now it's time to watch Season 3. Also, if you want to discuss this series with me and other people in real time, join the Familiar of Zero Discord server. We're currently doing a rewatch discussion going an episode a day. The link to the server is in the description. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you really like hearing about The Familiar of Zero, I've got at least 3 more videos coming on it. But there's only 4 seasons. What could that last video be about? I don't know. To be continued.